On June 6, 1944, as 5,000 Allied ships approached the Normandy coast and 150,000 men prepared to assault 5 beaches, Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt stood in his headquarters outside Paris reviewing intelligence reports that seemed to confirm everything German High Command had believed for months. The main Allied invasion, he assured his staff with absolute certainty, would strike at Calais. Normandy was obviously a diversion. The real blow would come where it made military sense, where any competent commander would strike. At the Pas de Calais, the narrowest point of the English Channel with barely 20 miles of water separating England from France, lay the gateway to the industrial Ruhr and the most direct route to the heart of Germany itself. He was absolutely wrong. And the realization of just how wrong, how completely and systematically German High Command had been deceived, would unfold over the following weeks like a slow-motion catastrophe. Each new piece of evidence would force them to confront the uncomfortable truth that they had been outmaneuvered, not on the battlefield but in the realm of pure deception. While they had concentrated their strongest forces to defend against an invasion that would never come, the actual invasion had already succeeded. The story of how German High Command reacted when they finally understood the Calais invasion was fake is not a story of a single dramatic moment of realization but rather a story of denial, of cognitive dissonance, of military officers so committed to their analysis that they continued to believe in a phantom army even as real Allied forces broke out of Normandy. It was a story of Hitler's intuition battling his general's logic and of an intelligence apparatus so thoroughly compromised that every report confirmed German assumptions about the coming catastrophe. The Allies faced a fundamental problem in their invasion planning that threatened the entire operation. They knew where they needed to invade. Normandy possessed suitable beaches and proximity to the port of Cherbourg, which would be essential for sustained operations. But the Germans knew the same geography. If the Allies telegraphed their intentions too clearly, the Wehrmacht would concentrate overwhelming force at the landing sites and the invasion would fail. Thousands would die on the beaches. The war would be prolonged or perhaps lost entirely. So the Allies decided to make the Germans believe something that was completely untrue. They would create an entire fictional invasion plan complete with armies that did not exist, preparations that were elaborate theater, and intelligence that was carefully crafted lies. They would convince the Germans that the invasion would strike at Calais, and they would make them believe it so thoroughly that even after the real invasion began, German High Command would still think Calais was the true target. The operation was called Fortitude, and it was the most elaborate deception in military history. In southeastern England, across from Calais, the Allies assembled an army that existed only in the German imagination. The 1st United States Army Group, called FUSAG, supposedly comprised 11 divisions totaling over 150,000 men preparing to cross the Channel at its narrowest point. The Germans tracked this force through their intelligence networks, through aerial reconnaissance, through radio intercepts. Every source confirmed it. FUSAG was real. It was massive, and it was commanded by General George Patton, the American commander the Germans feared most. Patton's presence at Dover opposite Calais was particularly convincing because the Germans had studied his aggressive tactics in Sicily and Italy. They respected his ability to exploit breakthroughs and turn tactical victories into strategic routes. If the Allies were planning a knockout blow, Patton would lead it. His location opposite Calais confirmed what German military logic already suggested. The main invasion would strike there. What the Germans did not know was that FUSAG did not exist. There were no 11 divisions massing in southeastern England. Patton was at Dover not because he would lead the invasion but because the Allies needed the Germans to believe he would. The entire army was fiction, a construct of deception so elaborate that it created its own reality in German minds. The physical deception was remarkably simple yet brilliantly executed. In fields across southeastern England, Allied engineers assembled an army of rubber and canvas. Inflatable Sherman tanks sat in neat rows that from the air looked exactly like armored formations. Plywood landing craft floated in harbors, convincing from altitude but hollow shells up close. Fake oil storage depots constructed from painted canvas stretched over scaffolding suggested the logistics infrastructure needed for a major invasion. Dummy aircraft built from wood and fabric crowded airfields. When the Germans flew reconnaissance missions and their cameras captured these installations, they saw exactly what the Allies wanted them to see. Massive military concentrations, tank parks, landing craft, supply depots. Everything pointed to Calais. But the physical deception was only part of the illusion. The more sophisticated element was the radio traffic. Allied signals units created an entire fictional communications network transmitting thousands of messages that suggested divisional movements, supply requests and tactical planning. The normal radio chatter of a real army preparing for combat filled the airwaves. German signals intelligence intercepted this traffic and analyzed it, building up a detailed picture of FUSAG's order of battle, its readiness status, and its probable invasion timeline. Every message was carefully scripted, every transmission was calculated to reinforce the deception. The Allies knew the Germans were listening, so they gave them exactly what they expected to hear. The accuracy and consistency of the radio traffic made it impossible for German analysts to believe it was false. The sheer volume of communications suggested an enormous military force preparing for a major operation. Thousands of intercepted messages all told the same story. FUSAG was real. It was in southeastern England, and it was preparing to invade at Calais. Then there were the double agents. And this was perhaps the most crucial element, the factor that made the deception not just plausible but convincing beyond any doubt. The Germans believed they had an extensive spy network in Britain with more than 40 agents providing intelligence on Allied preparations. In reality, every single one of these agents had been captured and turned by British counterintelligence. The double-cross system meant that every intelligence report the Germans received from Britain was written by Allied intelligence officers and carefully crafted to support the deception. The Germans trusted these agents completely. They had no reason not to because the intelligence had been reliable for years. When these agents reported seeing Patton at Dover, seeing tank formations in Kent, seeing landing craft massing across from Calais, German intelligence accepted the reports as confirmation of what their other sources suggested. One agent in particular, a Spaniard named Juan Pujol, known to the Germans as Arabelle and to the British as Garbo, was considered by the Abwehr to be their most valuable source in Britain. He supposedly ran a network of sub-agents across the country providing detailed reports on Allied activities. In reality, Garbo was working for British intelligence and his entire spy network was fictional. Every agent he claimed to run was imaginary. Every report was carefully constructed deception. The Germans never suspected Garbo's intelligence was so good, so detailed, so apparently well-sourced that they trusted him completely. When he reported on FUSAG's preparations, they believed him without question. When he described Patton's presence at Dover, they noted it in their intelligence summaries as confirmation. When he warned them that the main invasion would strike at Calais, they adjusted their defensive dispositions accordingly. By early June 1944, the deception was complete and the consequences were immense. German High Command had deployed the 15th Army with 19 divisions totaling approximately 250,000 men to defend the Pays de Calais. This was the strongest concentration of German forces in France, positioned at the point where they expected the invasion and ready to throw the Allies back into the sea. Meanwhile, at Normandy, German defenses were comparatively light. Rommel had strengthened them by adding obstacles and mines to the beaches, but the troop concentrations were much smaller. The Germans expected a diversionary attack there, something to draw forces away from Calais before the main blow fell. They were prepared for a feint. They were not prepared for the actual invasion. When the first reports reached German headquarters in the early hours of June 6, the reaction was confusion rather than alarm. Paratroopers were dropping inland from the Normandy coast. Naval bombardment had begun, but the scales seemed wrong for a main invasion. Surely this was the diversion they had anticipated. Von Rundstedt reviewed the incoming reports with his staff. The landings appeared to be occurring across a 50-mile front involving 5 separate beaches. Significant forces certainly, but not the massive concentration that would be needed for the main effort. The weather was terrible with storms in the channel and poor visibility. Perhaps the Allies were taking advantage of the bad weather to launch their diversion, knowing the Germans would not expect an invasion in such conditions. The critical question was whether to release the panzer reserves. Rommel had argued for positioning armor close to the beaches where it could respond immediately to an invasion. Von Rundstedt had insisted on holding the panzers back and concentrated inland where they could be deployed against the main invasion wherever it came. Now, with reports of landings at Normandy, the decision had to be made. Von Rundstedt hesitated because if he sent the panzers to Normandy and the main invasion struck at Calais, he would have no reserves to stop it. The 15th Army at Calais had infantry divisions and well-fortified positions, but they would need armored support to defeat a major Allied landing. If he committed the panzers prematurely to a diversionary attack, he would be playing into the Allied strategy. He decided to wait. The panzers would remain in reserve until the situation clarified. Normandy would be contained with local forces. It was exactly the decision the Allied deception planners had hoped he would make. As dawn broke on June 6 and the scale of the Normandy landings became clearer, some German commanders began to question the assessment that this was merely a diversion. 5,000 ships, massive aerial bombardment, airborne divisions dropped inland. This looked like a main invasion. But the intelligence picture contradicted what they were seeing. FUSAG was still at Dover. Patton's army had not moved. Aerial reconnaissance confirmed it. Radio intercepts confirmed it. Agent reports confirmed it. The massive force assembled opposite Calais remained in position, clearly preparing for their own invasion. If Normandy was the main effort, why would the Allies keep their strongest forces and their best commander sitting idle across from Calais? The only logical conclusion was that Normandy, despite its scale, was still a diversion. The real invasion was yet to come. Hitler, at his headquarters in Berchtesgaden, reached the same conclusion after reviewing the situation. When awakened with news of the landings, he initially seemed pleased rather than alarmed. The Allies had committed themselves. Now he knew where they were. The Atlantic Wall would hold them at the beaches, and when they were pinned down, When they had committed their reserves to the Normandy fighting, then the real blow would fall at Calais, and the Wehrmacht would be ready. He ordered the 15th Army to remain in position. No forces were to be transferred from Calais to Normandy. The main invasion was still coming. Throughout June 6th, as American troops fought their way off Omaha Beach, as British forces pushed inland from Gold Beach, as Canadians secured Juno Beach, the 15th Army remained at Calais, waiting for an invasion that would never come. 19 divisions, 250,000 men, the strongest German force in France, standing guard against ghosts. By June 7th, the situation at Normandy was clearly serious and demands for reinforcements were becoming urgent. The Allies had established a lodgment. They were bringing forces ashore continuously. The beachhead was expanding. Local German counterattacks had failed to push them back into the sea. This was not behaving like a diversion. Rommel, commanding Army Group B, which included the Normandy defenders, urgently requested reinforcements. He needed the 15th Army. He needed the panzer reserves. The Allies were ashore and strengthening their position every hour. If the Wehrmacht was going to defeat this invasion, they needed to concentrate everything they had against the Normandy beachhead immediately before it was too late. Von Rundstedt agreed with the assessment. He recommended to Hitler that the 15th Army be released, that the panzer reserves be committed to Normandy. The invasion was clearly happening there, not at Calais. Hitler refused. The Führer's intuition told him this was still a trick. The Allies wanted him to weaken Calais. They wanted him to commit his reserves to Normandy. Then the real invasion would strike and he would have nothing left to stop it. The 15th Army would remain in position, and then on June 9th, 3 days after D-Day, the agent Garbeau sent a message that confirmed Hitler's intuition was correct. The message, transmitted in the early morning hours, warned that the Normandy landings were indeed a diversion. Garbeau reported that his sources indicated a second larger invasion force was preparing to launch from southeastern England. The target was the Pas de Calais. The invasion there would begin within days. Normandy was a feint designed to draw German reserves away from the real objective. The message reached German High Command and was immediately forwarded to Hitler. Here was confirmation from their most trusted agent in Britain. The main invasion had not yet occurred. Normandy was the diversion they had suspected. Calais was still the target. Hitler was so impressed with this intelligence that he personally awarded Garbeau the Iron Cross for his exceptional service to the German nation. German High Command reinforced their commitment to defending Calais. The 15th Army would not move. The panzer reserves would be held back. They would not fall for the Allied trick. Of course, Garbeau's message was a lie. There was no second invasion force. Fusag did not exist. The entire report was crafted by British intelligence specifically to keep German forces frozen at Calais while the Allies consolidated their Normandy beachhead, and it worked perfectly. The Germans believed it completely, and their belief cost them dearly. Through the rest of June, as the battle for Normandy intensified, as the Allies captured Cherbourg and began their breakout from the beachhead, the 15th Army remained largely in place at Calais. Some units were eventually released and moved piecemeal to Normandy as the situation there became increasingly desperate. But the bulk of the force stayed put, defending against an invasion that existed only in their intelligence reports. German commanders at Normandy fought with whatever forces they had, increasingly outnumbered, increasingly outgunned, increasingly desperate for the reinforcements that were being held 150 miles away. They could not understand why the 15th Army was not being committed. The battle was at Normandy. The Allies were clearly making their main effort there. Why were 19 divisions sitting idle at Calais? The answer was that Hitler and much of German High Command still believed another invasion was coming. The intelligence picture continued to support this belief. Fusag remained at Dover. Radio traffic suggested continued preparations. Agent reports warned of imminent attack. The physical evidence continued to be visible in aerial reconnaissance photos. The Germans saw what they expected to see. They believed what their intelligence told them, and their intelligence was controlled by the Allies. The machinery of deception continued to function perfectly even as the actual battle raged at Normandy. The gradual realization that they had been deceived came not as a sudden revelation but as a slow accumulation of doubts that could no longer be ignored. By mid-July, more than a month after D-Day, it was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain the fiction that Normandy was a diversion. The Allies had landed more than 1 million men in France. They had broken out of the beachhead. They were advancing across Normandy. If this was a diversion, it was the most elaborate and successful diversion in history. And if it was a diversion, when was the main invasion going to occur? Some German intelligence officers began to question the agent reports. Why had Fusag not moved? Why was Patton still at Dover? Why had the second invasion not launched? The answers they received from their agents became increasingly vague and increasingly unsatisfying. Garbeau reported that the invasion had been postponed due to unexpectedly strong German resistance at Normandy. Other agents suggested the Allies were waiting for the Normandy fighting to draw more German reserves away from Calais before launching the main attack. The explanations were plausible, but they required believing that the Allies were willing to commit enormous forces to fight a massive battle, to take significant casualties, all as a diversion for an even larger operation. It was possible, certainly, but was it likely? By late July, the evidence had become overwhelming, and even the most committed believers in the Calais invasion began to have doubts. The Allies were clearly making their main effort at Normandy. The breakout was succeeding. American forces, under Patton, who had finally been brought to France and given command of the Third Army, were racing across Brittany and threatening to encircle German forces. If there had ever been a plan to invade at Calais, it had clearly been abandoned. The battle for France was happening at Normandy. The 15th Army began to be released. Units transferred south to try to contain the American breakout, to prevent the encirclement that was developing. But it was too late. The critical weeks after D-Day, when concentrated German forces might have defeated the invasion, had been spent waiting for a phantom army. The opportunity to throw the Allies back into the sea had passed. Now the Wehrmacht was fighting a desperate defensive battle, trying to prevent complete collapse. The full extent of the deception became clear only after the war, when captured German intelligence files revealed how completely the Abwehr had been penetrated, how thoroughly the double-cross system had controlled the intelligence picture, how the entire Fusag deception had been constructed and maintained with meticulous care. German intelligence officers reading these files in captivity realized that every agent they had trusted in Britain had been working for the Allies. Every report had been deception. The spy network they had relied on did not exist. The reaction among German high command varied considerably. Some, like General Alfred Jodl, Hitler's chief of operations, insisted they had made the correct decision based on the intelligence available. Calais was the logical invasion point. The intelligence confirmed it. Any competent commander would have defended it. That the intelligence was false, that they had been systematically deceived, was not a failure of judgment but simply the fog of war. Others were less charitable in their self-assessment. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, in captivity after the war, acknowledged that German intelligence had failed catastrophically. They had been outmaneuvered strategically before the battle even began. The Allies had won the intelligence war so completely that German high command never had accurate information on which to base their decisions. They had been fighting blind, reacting to phantoms, defending against invasions that never came while the real invasion succeeded. The cost was immeasurable. The cost of the deception was measured in divisions that never reached Normandy, in panzer units held in reserve while the beachhead expanded, in opportunities to counterattack that were never taken because forces were positioned elsewhere. In the crucial first weeks after D-Day, when concentrated German forces might have defeated the invasion, the Wehrmacht's strength was divided, much of it defending a stretch of coasts that was never attacked. General Hans von Salmuth, commander of the 15th Army, spent the weeks after D-Day preparing for an invasion he believed was imminent. His forces conducted exercises, reinforced positions, maintained high readiness. Intelligence reports continued to warn that the attack could come at any time. He positioned his troops accordingly, kept them concentrated, maintained defensive postures. Meanwhile, 150 miles away, the actual battle was being lost. When orders finally came to transfer forces to Normandy, Salmuth complied, but the movements were piecemeal. Divisions sent one at a time rather than as a concentrated force. The 15th Army was bled away gradually, its strength dissipated in reinforcing a battle that was already lost rather than concentrated for a decisive counterattack. By the time German high command fully committed to defending Normandy, the Allies had already won. The deception had achieved everything the planners hoped for, and more. The psychological impact of realizing they had been so thoroughly deceived was profound and lasting. German commanders had prided themselves on their military professionalism, their tactical and operational competence, to discover that they had been outmaneuvered not on the battlefield but in the realm of intelligence and deception, that they had been manipulated into making catastrophic strategic errors based on false information, was deeply damaging to their confidence. Some never fully accepted the truth. Hitler, until his death, insisted that his intuition about Calais had been correct, that the Allies had indeed planned a second invasion there but had been forced to abandon it due to German strength. The fact that no evidence supported this, that all captured Allied planning documents showed Normandy had always been the sole invasion site, did not shake his conviction. He had been right, and the failure was in execution, not in strategic judgment. Others recognized the deception for what it was but struggled to understand how it had succeeded so completely. How had every intelligence source been compromised? How had the Allies maintained such operational security that not a single reliable report of the actual invasion plans reached German intelligence? How had they created and sustained the illusion of an entire fictional army for more than a year? The answers, when they emerged, were sobering and revealed just how sophisticated the Allied deception had been. The Allies had won the intelligence war through a combination of factors that the Germans had not anticipated and could not counter. The double-cross system had neutralized German espionage in Britain completely. The physical deception, the inflatable tanks and dummy installations had been convincing enough to pass aerial reconnaissance. The radio deception had been sophisticated enough to fool German signals intelligence. And most importantly, the Germans had believed what they expected to believe. Their own assumptions about where the invasion should logically occur had made them vulnerable to deception that confirmed those assumptions. The Calais deception was successful not because the Germans were incompetent but because the Allies understood how they thought, what they would expect, what they would believe. The deception was tailored to German military logic. It made sense. It was plausible. It was supported by multiple intelligence sources. It was exactly what a competent intelligence analysis would conclude, and it was completely false. The irony was that if the Germans had ignored their intelligence and relied solely on military logic, they would have reached the same conclusion. Calais was the obvious invasion point. It made strategic sense. Any military academy would teach that the shortest route, the best port facilities, the most direct path to Germany, all pointed to Calais. The intelligence simply confirmed what logic suggested. But military logic is only useful if your opponent is predictable. The Allies were not predictable. They chose Normandy precisely because it was not the obvious choice, because the Germans would expect Calais, because they could exploit that expectation. They turned German military logic against itself. When General Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander, learned after the war how long the Germans had continued to believe in the Calais invasion, he expressed satisfaction that the deception had worked even better than hoped. The goal had been to keep German forces divided for the first few days after D-Day, to prevent immediate concentration against the beachhead. Instead, the deception had kept major forces frozen at Calais for weeks, long enough for the Allies to build up overwhelming strength in Normandy and begin their breakout. The success of Operation Fortitude changed military thinking about deception forever. It demonstrated that, in modern warfare, with multiple intelligence sources and sophisticated analysis, it was still possible to deceive an opponent completely, to make them believe something false so thoroughly that they would act on it, even when contradictory evidence accumulated. The key was not a single lie but an entire system of deception, multiple sources all confirming the same false picture, presented in a way that aligned with the enemy's expectations and assumptions. For the German commanders who lived through it, the realization of how completely they had been fooled remained a bitter memory. They had made decisions in good faith based on the best intelligence available, following sound military logic, and every decision had been wrong, not because they were incompetent but because the information they relied on was controlled by their enemy. In the end, what German high command said when they realized the Calais invasion was fake varied by individual, by timing, by circumstance. Some denied it even when the evidence was overwhelming. Some accepted it with professional resignation, acknowledging they had been outmaneuvered. Some raged at the intelligence failure, at the compromised agents, at the systematic deception. They had been defeated not by superior force but by superior intelligence. They had lost the battle before it began, not on the beaches of Normandy but in the minds of their commanders who had been led to defend the wrong place, to hold back the wrong forces, to wait for an invasion that never came while the real invasion succeeded. The 15th Army, 250,000 men, 19 divisions, the strongest German force in France, had spent the crucial weeks after D-Day waiting at Calais, defending against rubber tanks and plywood landing craft, guarding against a phantom army commanded by Patton that existed only in radio traffic and agent reports. They had been ready. They had been positioned. They had been prepared to fight. They just had been in the wrong place. And by the time German high command finally accepted that truth, finally acknowledged that they had been deceived, finally released the 15th Army to join the battle at Normandy, it was too late. The invasion had succeeded. The beachhead was secure. The breakout had begun. The battle for France was lost. Operation Fortitude stands as one of history's greatest military deceptions, a testament to the power of intelligence, planning, and understanding an enemy's mind.